Hello and welcome to another album analysis. In today's video we're taking a look at the 15th studio album from the English band Depeche Mode titled Memento Mori. The title of this album does translate to Remember You Have to Die, and because of that we're going to see the album exploring themes of death very heavily. And the band will certainly be looking to bounce back after their politically charged album Spirit wasn't seen as the strongest success for the band. Ever since the turn of the millennium, many feel most of their albums since then have not been particularly strong, most notably Playing the Angel and Sounds of the Universe remaining the strongest, but Delta Machine and Spirits have certainly been on the much weaker side of the band's discography. So will this latest album prove to be the death of the band or simply give them new life? Let's take a look at it track by track. Opening the album we do have My Cosmos Is Mine. It was the second single to be released from the album, featuring these very big open spatial sounds and very eerie soundscapes. That coupled in with Dave Gahan's booming vocals almost had him enacting the part of a higher power. And I really like the way that the band used this as the opener to this album. It certainly sets the scene, really shows this atmospheric side that the band are going to heavily explore as the album does progress. And it also gives us some tricks that we do see on most of the band's material over their career. These beautiful layerings of vocals between Martin and Dave have always been really strong, and it's always great when they continue to make great use of that. In terms of the actual lyrical content on this track, it seems to touch on the idea of not messing with someone's mind. This idea of you are your own person, your own universe, don't let anybody mess with that and just go out there and be your own person. And it also could potentially touch on this idea of fame as well. It's something that we did see from some of the lyrics, certainly from Dave Gahan's personal point of view. The idea of negativity from the media, from different people, can really weigh you down. So not letting other people's thoughts be your crutch and really just living your own life. Up next we do move into Wagging Tongue, which had these much higher pitched synth sounds on it. It certainly reminded me of the earlier work that the band did include, which had that much more upbeat pace to it as well. But this song almost felt like it went further back than that. It almost felt like the track Autobahn by Kraftwerk. Because of these really big spatial open sounds they're going for on this album, it really fits in with the idea of what Kraftwerk were doing in the mid-70s, and it continued that idea of these high-pitched sounds. And because it's not something we're used to hearing from the band for such a long time, it was certainly interesting to see how they'd almost modernised it to fit in with the state of the album they've gone for. Also, with its plodding pace and talking about division through some really clever lyrics, it also touches on the death of good people who are the angels in this story. We always say that it's the good people that get taken first. It's something that's kind of quite commonly used, certainly within English language. It's almost a kind of term that is often thrown around. And I could also feel that this maybe the song on the album is a bit of an ode to Fletch. They always said he was going to be the one that passed on last, and he's actually been the first one to go. So could see that potential tie in as well. Then we do have Ghosts Again, which was the album's lead single, and for good reason. It was more upbeat than most of their recent discography. Straight away it showed us with this album we're going to be seeing a change in sound, and although they do keep this darker, gloomier tones from the instrumentation, it does feel like this album as a whole is much more upbeat and much more full of life, like a celebration, as opposed to trying to weigh you down and make you feel dark and depressed. Another reason for this being the lead single is I do feel like this is the song that best fits with the title of the album. It dances with the idea of it, knowing that you have to die, dealing with the loss of lovers, and interestingly, despite it talking about death, it is a song that invokes joy. It really makes you feel very positive despite the darker meanings that we do have in it, and I think that's partially due to the upbeat sound and also partly due to the fact that it talks about almost loved ones passing on, that they'll always be watching over you, and we see that reflected through the lyrics as well. This idea of reflection, this idea of bringing flowers to a grave, and just really kind of remembering people. Almost this idea of you die twice. Once when you physically pass on to the next world or to the afterlife, and then the second time when no one is there to remember you anymore. So it really does feel like this song touches on it with the idea of being ghosts again. Then we move into Don't Say You Love Me, a slower paced track that is full of suave from Dave Gahan, and it has this constant back and forth of you and I between the different lyrics, which I really like. It's almost like a game of table tennis, just just constantly serving towards each other, changing the perspective just every single line. And I really like the way they've done that. It was a track that I wasn't initially kind of over the top with, but as time went on, it really started to grow on me, just the way they structured this song in such a clever way, this idea of relationships being back and forth all the time, whilst also keeping these kind of spatial sounds in that really help to build a theme for this album. Even though they're touching on some things that don't quite revolve around the idea of death, they talk about the potential death of a relationship when it's kind of a constant back and forth of aggression being thrown from side to side. In at track 5, we do have My Favourite Stranger, and this feels like a much earlier Depeche Mode track with much darker elements, really touching on the idea of not knowing yourself, constant reference to the idea of your shadow kind of mirroring you, copying you, and it's certainly an interesting way to actually look at the idea that the death of a person doesn't always have to be a physical thing, it can be a mental thing as well. You become your favourite stranger, you become a shadow of yourself, so it's almost like that mental degradation that you could have. You could look at things like Alzheimer's as well being touched in with this track, the idea that you become a stranger to yourself or to other people because you just don't know exactly what's going on all of the time. So I like how every single song in some way can be linked to the death of something, and that's something that we have seen. As much as it tries to celebrate life, it certainly tries to touch on life and all its quirks as well, and all the things that can affect you in many different ways. At the midpoint of the album, we do have Soul With Me, and I love it when every single album has this ballad track when Martin Gore takes control of the vocals. It's one of the favourite things I always look forward to on a Depeche Mode album. I just love how it gives it this change of pace. It's usually towards the middle of the album where they just like to let him take the driving seat, just for one track especially. He often writes the track and sings the track. It's almost that thing of write the theme tune, sing the theme tune. It's really great how he does it, and he puts so much more almost emphasis into his singing compared to Dave Gahan. Dave Gahan has these much deeper tones, but one thing that Martin has is these much softer, more emotive tones, which really help to bring out the best of these ballad tracks, and it certainly does so on this, really showing the idea of accepting death in a positive manner. Next we move into Caroline's Monkey. Now this is the track on the album that definitely didn't grab me straight away, and I'm still a bit unsure about it. Despite having bouncier synths, and in some ways it does fit in with this actual album in terms of instrumentally, but lyrically I feel like it's the one track on the album that just pulls you out of the story that they're kind of building around the idea of death and the celebration of life. It was unfortunately just that one track where you just kind of lost the sense of where you were. You felt like they'd just gone off on a tangent for one song, and unfortunately it just meant that it was a little bit jarring to hear because of the kind of theme we've had running through just suddenly being disrupted. Despite that though, I do like some of the lyrics we do have, despite it being one of the more bizarre tracks on the album. It talks about the bearing of a burden or a problem you can't get rid of, and it does have again another bit of a Kraftwerk edge to it. So interesting to see how with these bouncier synths they are tying back to earlier sounds but almost adding a more futuristic element to it, which is really great to see. Much quicker vocal delivery as well, which is another reason I think it pulls you out of the album. It sort of really amps the pace up all of a sudden, despite these kind of slower pacings to the tracks that we have had on the rest of the album. Next we head into track 8, which is Before We Drown. There's a couple of things they do on this that I really love. We do see the return to the spatial sounds with very drawn out synth notes after the slightly weirder track that we did have from Caroline's Monkey, and we kind of dive back in to that sound that we have been hearing throughout the first 6 tracks. And one thing I really do like about this song is this idea later in the track where they're constantly building distance, but there's a moment where we have this idea of fading and we drown, like just it feels like you're descending into the ocean. You can picture yourself in the moment just kind of being dragged down underwater by the waves, that moment of peace and acceptance, like floating in a vast ocean, again adding to this big open space around you. And I love how they're doing that with the instruments on this album, all these little elements that they like to throw in and like to build to add this sort of ultimate soundscape that you can envelop yourself in. And this song is probably the strongest on the album for doing just that. It's either that or My Cosmos Is Mine, and I really like the way that you can feel yourself almost as if you were in that situation underwater, that peacefulness, that calmness, and that openness all being kind of incorporated into one. In at track 9, we don't have People Are People, we have People Are Good. And this is a song that certainly feels like it's akin to music for the masses, but with a much darker tone. We also do see a couple of moments where we see the return of this scratchy, distorted guitar sounds that is actually used on the intro of I Feel You. So a couple of different elements they really did draw in from different albums for this track, and we have seen that throughout this album so far, really drawing in lots of different elements and pulling them all together in a very strong way. It does also have this very big bouncy beat that really just helps to add a nice flowing element to the song, and also it likes to build false pretenses, this idea that everybody is good or you can believe that, and it's almost this idea of not everybody you come across is going to be a good person. So not quite fitting in with the death theme, but they've again used the instruments to build that sort of keep us in line, keep us in check with the story of the album, even though the lyrics don't touch on the same thing, and it kind of looks more at a general aspect of life instead of actually death as a whole. Next up, we have got Always You, another plodding track that talks about how loved ones tether you to this world. They are effectively your grounding rod. You use them as a reason to continue, as a reason to go on. They become everything that you do and everything that you live for. And it is a very sweet track because of the nature of its meaning. And it's something that many can relate to. I mean, you see it in multiple forms of media, this idea of you keep fighting for somebody. You're not always fighting for yourself, but more this other person that sort of tethers you to this world. So it's really sweet in the way it kind of builds this idea of this story, this idea of fighting and continuing even at the darkest of times, just to make sure that you're sticking around for somebody who deeply cares about you. And it's also another song that makes use of these very early Depeche Mode synth sounds, but adds a much more futuristic touch to them. It almost brings them up to the 21st century, and I really like that because many people enjoyed that early sound they did have on some of their earlier albums when they had much more upbeat synths before they delved into the dark side of the Force. But at the same time, it also felt like it never quite fit what the band were trying to achieve, whereas with this futurized styling of it, it actually works much better as the band have aged, and they kind of looking to celebrate and have an upbeat album as opposed to all the dark dreariness that we have seen on recent releases. Heading towards the end of the album, we do have the track Never Let Me Go, and this is a song that's much more guitar driven than the rest of the actual album, and it's great to see them making use of that guitar work. I mean, it's something they really started to adopt on albums such as Songs of Faith and Devotion, going forward towards Ultra as well. They really accepted those guitars and really made them work, so I really like that they have one track on here that really dives into that very heavily. Rather than letting the synths constantly control the beat, they make use of some great guitar riffs just to really drive the track forward. It is a track very much about wasting time. Time is a finite resource that we don't have an unlimited supply of, well, not currently anyways, but it just really adds to that idea, and it's almost got this slightly more impatient and agitated vocal style from Dave Gahan, which I really did enjoy. It's almost like he's fed up with this person wasting his time, and that's shown through the vocal delivery and the lyrics. I think it's really smart this way this song is put together. Also references to the idea of light and dark. It's a theme that we've seen running throughout the album. They've made reference to it. I mean, it's something that's very easy to tie with the idea of life and death, these two opposites that are represented by two very different things that fit very well together. And it does have this occasional scattering of random sounds that just fit like a glove. They've done it throughout pretty much most of this album. Just occasionally, just out of nowhere, this random sound will come in, but it never feels out of place. It never feels like it doesn't belong. And I think it's really great how they've managed to pull that off, because if they had the opposite effect where it was like, why is that sound been included, then it would kind of pull you out of the moment again and have the complete polar opposite effect and really make you question why it had been used. Rounding out the album, we do have Speak to Me. Now, I feel this is quite a smart closer for the actual album itself. Many know that Dave Gahan has had a lot of issues in the past, and even on this album, having to deal with the death of Fletch has been quite hard for the band. And I actually touched on my album ranking the idea how when the band are suffering from really kind of big, prominent issues, whether it be substance abuse, death, anything like that, they write some of their best music because it's the most meaningful and the most impactful. And this song really is kind of an amalgamation of that. It's a song that explores loneliness, emptiness, this idea of wanting to be with people but also not. It feels very personal, I feel, for Dave Gahan, this push and pull of life, and it almost feels like it touches on the band because it feels like Martin is the one that kind of pulls him out. He keeps him in line and is almost the reason that he is able to turn it around. I mean, I don't think he wanted to make this album, but Martin kind of convinced him that it was a good idea to do it, and you can see that it adds this mix of sound that had a very much an eeriness, a very indecisive sound to the song. This idea that you've got the devil and the angel on your shoulder and you're never really sure which way to go. You've got somebody guiding you along the way to kind of bring out the best in yourself, and that's the way I feel that it certainly works for the band, with Martin often being the driving force and the guiding light for the rest of the band to really push themselves forward. So overall, I was really impressed with this album. It definitely exceeded my expectations. I love these spatial sounds. I love the mix of sounds that we have got on this album. I like that almost everything feels like it keeps you in check, keeps you engaged in the story they're trying to tell, the way they're exploring death, but in a much more positive and upbeat light. It's not something we've seen from the band in quite some time. They're so used to playing around this dark, dreary sound that it's a nice change to see them drawing in different elements from different eras of the band and really modernising some of those older elements that they did have. Unfortunately, the one thing that I do feel lets this album down is Caroline's Monkey. I mean, it's a good track, but it also just pulls you completely out of the effect that the album is trying to give. It's that one point in the album, it's that blip where you just sort of lose focus on exactly where this album is going. And it's a real shame because I do feel like lyrically it's certainly something very different, very interesting, but unfortunately it's just one song that I couldn't quite get to the point where I really enjoyed it because it just kind of spoiled this kind of experience I was going through as I was moving my way through the album. Although I don't think it lives up to the same standard as some of their albums from the late 80s, early 90s when they were really at their prime, I do feel like this is one of the best albums they have produced since the turn of the millennium. I'm just loving the amount of things they've thrown onto this. It's certainly better than albums such as Exciter, than Delta Machine, Spirits. Maybe it's kind of on the same level as albums such as Playing the Angel, probably better than Sounds of the Universe in its overall just ability to pull everything together in such a strong way. And I certainly feel like it's like many of their albums from that late 80s, early 90s period, certainly albums such as Ultra, it's drawn a lot of power from the darkness that has happened in their lives, from the death of Fletch, from the band really losing a big part of themselves over the past 40 years, and they've managed to do the same again as they did on Ultra and Songs of Faith and Devotion, where they turn these negative aspects into some of the strongest music that the band will then go on to produce. And for those reasons, I'm going to give the album a very deserved, I feel, 8 out of 10. I really did enjoy this album much more than I was expecting. I was probably being a little bit pessimistic about it, but it certainly exceeded my expectations with the great mix of sounds that it did include, and just great to see them, I feel, returning to form, for finally ditching that just depressing sound that they did have over recent past couple of albums and going for something a bit more full of life and a bit more upbeat. So that will be everything for today's video, but please feel free to let me know your thoughts about this album in the comments section below. I would certainly love to read them, just really see how everybody else feels, whether you feel like it is one of the better albums since the turn of the millennium, or whether you feel like it has been a bit of a letdown and you were hoping or expecting better things from this album. Please do let me know. And as always, if you want to see more content like this, then please do feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next album analysis.